So welcome to the second online edition of the Grief and Loss class. I am your host for whatever we're calling this thing. So we're going to cover two different models today, the Worden model or tier model and Kubler-Ross's. I will tell you that I'm going to be putting up another interview so that you have an opportunity. You'll get credit for watching it. How tough can that be to watch an interview with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross? The one enticing thing will not only be getting to hear Kubler-Ross, but you will see a very, very, very young Oprah on top of it all. So she interviewed her at the end of her life, and she has a pretty heavy Swiss accent, so I would encourage you to put the closed captioning on so you can follow a little bit of what they said. I don't know on mine, but the closed captioning didn't help that much, but I could at least make out what she was talking about. So what we're going to be doing and looking at here is the Worden model first and foremost. And so again, what I want to do a real quick review is where we left off was the attachment theory, and then we also looked at Westberg's theory. I mentioned to you last time that the attachment theory really is the basis for all of these other models, and that's true for Worden's as well. He came at it a little bit differently and borrowed some ideas and thoughts out of Erik Erikson's approach to lifespan development by looking at and talking about tasks that people have to accomplish. This is probably a little bit more accurate. It looks differently different depending on where in the lifespan you are, because kids will approach this very differently than adults will. But the tasks of grief look something like this. Like I said, it's referred to as the tier model, makes it easier to remember. So the tasks of grief include to accept the reality of the loss, to experience the pain. Experience also means expression, so the E's fit together with that. Adjusting to the new environment without the person in it. And then the last thing is to reinvest in the new reality. So that's the framework that we're going to run at this thing from. Before we get any further into it, I had promised to you last time that I have some vignettes to show you as we go along here. This first one is K. Redfield Jamison. You may recognize her name for those of you who had Abnormal with Demos. He required a book for you to read called The Unquiet Mind, which was this same lady. She's a doctorate in psychology. Brilliant lady, and you can tell that she has a psychological background just by how she describes her husband, who she lost to lung cancer. So I will let her tell a little bit of her story. I'll underline a few things on the backside, and then we'll keep moving.
I loved Richard almost immediately. He was charming in the best possible sense, substantively, not superficially. He was curious about everything. He had a genuine twinkle in his eye. I mean, people talk about people having twinkles in their eyes, but he really did have a twinkle. I just found him fascinating. I found him fascinating from the minute I met him till the moment he died. He was diagnosed with lung cancer, and we knew that it was terminal, that they couldn't operate, and that it had spread to both lungs. You know, you're crazy in love with somebody, and you know they're going to die. It was sudden when it happened. I didn't think it would happen when it did. When that person is not there, and you kiss them for the last time, it's just... It's agonizing, you know. You cannot believe it's true. You know it's true, and that's that. I felt like an animal that had lost its mate, but there's just this sort of wild, primitive sadness. I think grief is surprisingly complex. I think of it a lot like black ice, where you think that you are on steady footing and that you're doing okay, and then all of a sudden you're just slammed and you fall flat. You're overwhelmed, aching for someone, wishing they were there. I'm not sure why grief exists. I mean, I think there are a lot of people who speculate. To me, it's the price you pay for being human. It's the price you pay for being in love with someone. I grieve my husband because I don't want him to be forgotten.
So what we have here is a remarkable statement, a couple statements on her part that I would mention to you or highlight for you. The first one is I don't know why grief exists. Perhaps it's the price for being human. And we have talked about this in class, is that our grief is very much connected to our connection, and our loss is connected to our love. And so she mentioned that same thing. It's kind of the price of love, if you will. And in a lot of cases when we see that, we think, yeah, if that's the case, then I'm not sure I want to pay the entry fee. And that's understandable. And then she also mentions the idea of black ice, which I think is a very apt description of how people experience loss. Is that they've got their footing, they've had a decent day, and then the next day goes to hell in a handbasket. So there is a variety of aspects to this that she describes. The other thing she mentions, which probably gives away her psych background, is that I felt like an animal that lost its mate, and I'm yearning and longing for it. And we talked a little bit about that with attachment, and she mentions that as well here. So where we go, let's walk into Worden's tasks. The very first one is to accept the reality of the loss. All of this includes a willingness to accept that reunion is impossible. Now, she said something really interesting, that she knew it but didn't know it. And that's a key thing that we'll look at here in a second. But the idea of accepting it in this first task is really tough, because we equate accepting something to being the same as I'm saying that what happened is okay. And I've talked about this before in other settings, but this task is not, I flipped the switch and now I've got this task under control and I can do it just fine. It has nothing to do with that. What you end up seeing in terms of how a person goes through accepting the reality of the loss is these phantom experiences. And a lot of times they'll see somebody on a street and are sure that it's the person that they've lost. I think I've mentioned this too as well about my experiences as a kid and having somebody hearing the back door open when my dad came home from working at the steel mill. So it includes this denial of various kinds. We've talked about the different aspects of that, of denying the facts, denying the meaning, and denying that death is irreversible. Each one shows itself a little bit differently in the person. The other thing I'll add is that these tasks are equally as fitting for other losses than just death. Okay, and so I've been trying to do some of this translation for you guys between losing somebody to death and losing just a relationship, or even as we've been talking about, and some of the seniors have, dealing with this is the loss of a future or the loss of the end of a semester. What does that look like? Well, at some point we're still in this stunned phase that is it really real? I'm hoping that tomorrow morning I'll wake up and it'll all be over. And that's very much a part of the backdrop, I think, of what we're talking about here. The other thing, in terms of the denial, some of the examples we talked about is the mummification, keeping everything the same. Like I said, with loss and just loss of a relationship, we keep our schedules the same. I mean, interestingly enough, in the situation that we're all in right now, there are lots of us, myself included, that I kind of refuse to have my schedule change any. Including getting up and following my same schedule and doing the same things I always do, and following the same routine I've always done. And it's like I don't want to move around too much. It's a little bit like when you have a skinned knee, you fall or whatever, and you don't want anybody to touch it. And that same thing is true for us with this mummification idea. The other flip side of that is sanitizing the environment of anything that would remind us of that person. The problem is with that, and that has something to do with meaning, how significant or insignificant it was. If I can just move it out of the way and get it out of my out of the remembrance, I won't feel the pain anymore. The problem is that there are plenty of remembrances in our heads, in our emotions. Hearing music or even smelling something is enough, and that makes it even tougher. And then the idea of selective forgetting, and we've talked about these and reviewed those when we were talking about just the denial aspects of the mile markers we were talking about as well. So some other ones that we have to mention just by way of review, and you guys took a lot of this down, is denying irreversibility, engaging in spiritualism, engaging in, in a sense, I don't want to believe that this is over, that I'm going to have to do this, so I don't plan, I don't think about it, whatever that might be. The other one that I think we have to contend with is not just intellectual acceptance, but emotional acceptance. And what does this look like? Well, I can tell you that it's over. That's the intellectual part. But my heart and my emotions have really not caught up with what it all means. Oftentimes what ends up happening is just the date passes. And when we hit the end of the semester and there's no final, there are final projects and everything else, or you complete your final project and it's the final project, and there's no other project after that, and there's this huge yawning period of time ahead of you that is unstructured. There aren't the expectations, the rhythm of a semester and all of that. Then sometimes, excuse me, and then sometimes the emotions catch up with us, and then we have the work to do. So, and I'll tell you for myself, it's hard, and I've written this down in my journal. It's hard to try to catch up with my heart here on this one, because there's just so much to do on my end, at least. Now, you guys, I'm hearing various reports of the things that you have to do. And that tends to distract you from what it is you're feeling about all of this stuff and thinking about it. Hopefully, your groups gives you a little bit of an outlet to spend some time to reconnect. The other thing that happens here is something that's referred to as this belief and disbelief alternates. So I know that it's happening. I know that's what indeed it is. But then on the other hand, I just can't believe it. And on another hand, I know it. And that we go back and forth and back and forth. And what's mentioned, oftentimes the term is used in existential understanding, is middle knowledge, is both knowing and not knowing. And Redfield Jamison actually refers to that, is that she knows it, but she doesn't know it. A lot of times we'll call it, I can't wrap my head around it, or I can't get it in my brain, or anything like that. And so in a lot of cases, the traditional rituals are helpful, and the things that will mark time for us, because that's really what rituals do for us. And they're very much a part of what we're talking about here in this task one. So a task is not time limited. And that's what's particularly important about Worden's approach to this, is that I have work to do. That's what we talk about in grief all the time, and loss, is that it's grief work, or working through the issues of the loss that I have. And when I get to the quote-unquote end of it, even though there's not always an end, because when I enter the next task, I'm still carrying with me the work that I've done in the first one. But there's always a sense of I'm turning a corner, I'm opening a new page. We talked a little bit about it in class when I mentioned about the idea of good goodbyes and putting a punctuation at the end of a chapter. That's equally true. There's an acceptance to the reality that this is over, this is done. It's time to move into the next phase, which brings us then to task 2, and that is that to experience the pain of the grief. The German word Schmerz refers to the totality of pain, not just the physical sensation, but also the emotional and behavioral aspects that go along with it. And that's more of what a lot of times people talk about. They may not have any physical pain. Now, sometimes we do. There are plenty of us that at times when we feel psychologically distressed, that it turns into, not by any volition on our part, but it turns into a physical sensation, a gut ache or a stomach ache or a headache or shoulder and muscle pain or whatever that might be. In a lot of cases, people tend to be more prone sometimes to transferring psychological distress into physical distress. So everybody experiences pain differently, and we've talked about this before. I've mentioned it to you. Is that any nurse, and that would be true even in hospitals today, is walking in and saying, "What's your pain level today?" They're not going to argue the person out of their experience with the pain that they have. They are listening to it and noticing it, and from that person's perspective, that's the basis on which they judge the change in pain, which is probably more important than actually the number itself. So everybody gets at this differently. It's like, it's no big deal, it's fine, the denial thing, or it's nothing compared to somebody else, I don't know what I'm complaining about, or they're highly reactive to it, so much so that they're immobilized by it. So everybody comes to it very differently. Everybody defines their own pain, which helps us if we want to walk alongside people. We don't stand off and judge how much pain they're in or what they should be in or anything like that. The biggest challenge, I think, for anybody that's walking alongside somebody who's experienced a loss is to allow them to be the ones to define the terms of the pain that they experience and the things that they're dealing with. The thing to keep in mind is that if it's not done, what you end up seeing is a rerouting, if you will, into physical, emotional, even mental symptoms. And what I mean by that is cognitive symptoms. A difficulty concentrating, forgetfulness, distractedness, all of those things. And so to be able to experience the pain and move into it and allow it to exist and accept it is the beginning of a lot of the work that has to be done around it. And that's what we have to talk about in this particular task. The other aspects that go along with this is we have to spend some time kind of going back and reminding ourselves about some of the things we talked about in attachment. Because in most cases, most people are unprepared for the intensity of the pain that they're going to experience. Now, again, like I said, this is psychological, emotional pain we're talking about. This is not physical pain. Some people will translate it, like I said before. So we have to keep some of these attachment styles in mind, and I thought what I do is just remind you of these and then put them in the context of the whole grieving thing. So the first one, in terms of secure attachment, secure attachment is an unconditional one. The child knows that their caregiver is not going to let them down. They are reliable. They feel loved and accepted no matter what. The children's learn this secure style are active and they interact more confidently with their environment. In other words, they tend to take a little bit more risks because they know that the caregiver is going to be there with them. There is a fair amount of emotional harmony between the child and the caregiver or the attachment figure. what that translates into is later in life, then they tend to have equally healthier relationships in adulthood. It isn't difficult for them to build relationships with others. They don't fear abandonment. Dependency in their minds is reciprocal. The other person does as well, and they aren't really afraid of being alone. Now, when you put somebody who has a secure attachment into this context that we're talking about, experience the pain of grief, they tend to have enough key attachment figures around them outside of the person that they've lost that they're free to move into this and let themselves feel it and to get the support that they're going to get from the people around them. So secure attachment, as we talked about when we were looking at that particular theory, is that everybody's got a little bit different approach to it. They have had different experiences. Sometimes there is a telltale experience. Sometimes there's a bunch of experiences growing up around attachment, and they learn this one style over another. But people that come out of a secure attachment oftentimes will move into grief a little bit more easily. Not that it's painless, but a little bit more easily because they know that they have the support and encouragement of the people around them, even though they're without the key person that they have attached to. Second one is the anxious ambivalent attachment. In this case, the child can't trust his or her caregiver and feels really constantly insecure about it, and so that a lot of times these kids are continuously and always watching to make sure that they are close to and connected to the attachment figure, whoever that might be. What that means is they don't explore their environment very much. Now, let me give you an example real quickly. If I vividly remember this from one of my jobs in the mental health field, is that I was working at the mental health center, and we were doing what was called socialization groups for kids that were coming from pretty underprivileged families. And I'll never forget, this one kid came in with her mom, and she we weren't starting the group yet, so they were waiting, and mom was looking at a magazine, and this little girl would not detach from her mom at all. As a matter of fact, she interfered with her mom's ability to even look at the magazine. I said something to my co-therapist at the time and said, boy, you'd think that if she could unzip her and climb in, she would do that, speaking of the mom. So they're little gamblers. They don't want to risk missing anything of the love coming from the caregiver. And so they're always going to be stuck to them and cling to them very, very tightly. Now, on the flip side, had a similar parent come in, not the same parent, had another set of parents come in, and it wasn't this socialization group we were doing, but we were just doing assessment for healthy family styles and so forth. And this parent came in, this mom. She sat down in the waiting room, picked up a magazine. She had the little one on her hip and came in and checked in and sat down. Put the little one down in the waiting room, and the little one stood by her, held on. She was ambulatory, so she was getting around just fine. And she looked at mom, and she looked around, and we had some toys over in the far corner, and she just toddled her way over there, started playing with the toys. She'd cast a look over her shoulder to see that mom was still there, but she moved into her environment with a high degree of security, and knew that her mom was going to be there when she came back. And that's secure attachment versus anxious, ambivalent attachment. When we get into being adults, having had this in our background, they fear that the people that they're with don't truly love them. It's hard for them to interact the way that they'd like with others, since they expect more closeness or connection than they can even give to the other person. And so they run the risk of becoming enmeshed with the other person and needing and wanting something from them that the other person really can't give. What does this mean for grief? Well, you can only just imagine. Think further into it. because when the attachment figure is gone and loss has occurred, either to death or to the breaking of the relationship or whatever it might be, it's catastrophic. It is absolutely catastrophic. And they crumble psychologically, maybe emotionally. They have a hard time connecting to anybody, and a lot of times they will do the kind of the hunkering down and withdrawing and getting pulled into kind of this dark place because of the nature of the attachment that they had. Now, the next one is the avoidant. And avoidant children who grow up in these environments have accepted. They have actually accepted. Now remember, the anxious, ambivalent kids are not sure. But see, kids that grow up in with this attachment style have accepted the fact that they can't rely on their caretakers. And it is extremely painful to them. These little ones learn to live life feeling unloved and undervalued or unvalued. So a lot of times they don't express nor understand emotions, and oftentimes, as the name implies, they avoid intimate relationships because in a lot of cases it just opens them up to some more pain. When somebody opens the door and actually allows a relationship in, and then that relationship crumbles, it becomes catastrophic, very much like the anxious ambivalent one does. And then the last one is the disorganized, and this one was added much later. This type is the mix between the anxious and avoidance styles, and generally the child in this case acts in a contradictory way or inappropriate way. They can be explosive. They can do things like breaking toys and having a hard time getting along with their caregivers. It's almost as if they're trying to test whether they're going to hang in there and hang in relationship with them. So they avoid intimacy, but they also want that intimacy desperately, which leads to a lot of very disorganized behavior, and that's why we call it that. So when you have an adult with this style that they have grown up in, they're constantly struggling with not feeling loved, looking at life from a contractual point of view. If I do this, then the person will stay. And oftentimes leads to a very tumultuous relationship as well. So in a lot of cases, somebody that's coming from this experience oftentimes ends up being in a position where they push the person away but keep asking them to come back. And the hand gestures would be having a hand out and then having another hand calling the person toward them or gesturing them toward them. And this ends up creating this tension between somebody who might be attracted to this person, might want to be in a relationship with them, but they keep getting these mixed signals all the time, and that's part of the backdrop to what we're talking about here with task 2. So when we try to understand how somebody goes about experiencing the pain of grief, it has a lot to do, and we need to be armed with bringing in our understanding of the attachment style of the person. Again, in a lot of these other cases and the things that we've talked about, outside of secure attachment, no one person is only one of these. A lot of times we're a mixture of these. Like I mentioned, the dramatic impact of my dad's death had a direct impact then later on how I attach to other people after that. And you might want to make a case for the kind of household I grew up in and the nature of my relationship with my two parents and everything that really probably impacted that and set that into motion. So this lands us then to look at this interplay, like I mentioned, between the culture and the mourner. This makes it even more difficult. This quote, I think, is pretty remarkable. Giving way to grief is stigmatized. So giving ourselves into and allowing ourselves to grieve is stigmatized as morbid, unhealthy, and demoralizing. The proper action of a friend and well-wisher is felt to be a distraction of the mourner from his or her grief. And so the upshot of that is that we're living, and I mentioned this in the last discussion or the last lecture, is that we're living in a culture that conspires against us experiencing grief at all. Now, remember something, okay? Because of that, is that if we experience or allow ourselves to experience this grief at all, okay, not in appropriate levels or processing it or anything like that, but in certain cultures that we're in, whether family or otherwise, if we experience any of it at all, then somehow there's something wrong and we're being morbid, or we're trying to feel sad, or any number of messages that come flying at us about that says that's not the way to handle this. You need to move on. And see, the way to sabotage this particular task is to cut off the feelings and deny the pain. So how do I do this? Well, I just don't think about it, or I only focus on pleasant thoughts, or I idealize the situation in the person, or I say, well, the future's going to get better. We could do that with this, right? I mean, we can look to, whenever these stay-at-home orders are finally over, and to that future and focus on that rather than allowing ourselves to at least feel a little bit of the discomfort that this has brought. The things that we've all lost in terms of the rituals at the end of the school year and things like that. Another way to sabotage it is alcohol and drugs. Interesting quote or stat I just heard is that in most cases, liquor stores, and here in Colorado at least, the pot stores have been considered essential. The liquor sales have gone off the charts right now, and people are experiencing a huge elevation in alcohol consumption, as well as other drugs as well. The other thing is that unfortunately for us, a geographic cure doesn't really help us, does it? I mean, you can leave from Colorado and go to Texas, and you're still in a stay-at-home condition, just as you were here. So the uniqueness of what we're going through right now is profound because of this very thing that we're talking about here, where I can't get away from it. I go home and I got to stay at home and away. And sometimes I'm stuck with people that I really don't want to be with, but I have to because there's nowhere else to go. Or I am with people that I like to be with, but I still need some alone time. I still need some time for myself. So all of these things come together and sabotage this task too. And that's where some of the problem happens, because if we don't resolve these tasks, going through our work through our grief, then usually we bring a lot of these issues with us into the next one, which brings us then to the end of stage 2, if you will, or task 2, I should say. And Bowlby himself said, sooner or later, some of those who avoid all conscious grieving break down, usually with some form of depression. So there's always a cost. There is always a cost with not processing these tasks well and allowing ourselves to experience it, finding people to share and to talk about it with. We're going to have to be looking for people that share the value of grieving and allowing ourselves to experience some of the things that we've lost. And you know, the reality is, like I said, all of us, a lot of the students have lost, the seniors have lost not only the end of their semester, but people going home and they've lost their jobs. Excuse me. They've lost their jobs. They have no income. Their reference points to life have been lost. And so John Bowlby said it very aptly, I think, when he talked about when we avoid all of this stuff, there's always a cost, and it ends up oftentimes in, I would say, increased anxiety or some form of depression, or both, because in some cases you can have a agitated depression. So what we get into is task 3. And task 3 has 3 different components to it in terms of external adjustments, internal adjustments, and then spiritual adjustments, which is interesting that Worden actually includes this. Now, the one thing that's interesting about when you go farther into and start talking about grief and loss, this is one of those areas where spirituality is talked about more than many other areas that we talk about that people actually struggle with. And so task 3 is to adjust to an environment where the deceased person is missing, or the broken relationship, the person is no longer involved. In terms of external adjustments, there has to be an adjustment to different things in different people, different routines, different rhythms, different ways of doing things. All of that is very, very hard to adjust to. And everybody varies in how easily they adapt to change. I think initially everybody would rather keep things as they are. Everybody would. But some people are willing to adapt a little bit more. But this realization often begins, as it says, to emerge around 3 to 4 months after the loss. And usually it involves coming to terms with the adaptations I have to make. Now, remember that when I make adaptations, I am moving toward acceptance, because I'm adapting to the environment without the person in it. And that means what? I'm accepting that it happened. If I reject it, if I sabotage it and undercut it, as we've already talked about, then I'm just not going to deal with the reality, and we've already talked about that. So living alone, raising children alone, facing an empty house or an empty apartment, not having the regular phone call at the end of every day, whatever that might be, and including, in this case, when we're talking about the loss of a spouse or a partner, is managing finances alone, having to make the decisions on our own. All of those are very much a part of the external adjustments that we're talking about. Some other external ones, a lot of times it is seldom clear to us, and again, I think for a lot of us this is true right now, is it's not real clear what I've lost. I may have a retroactive understanding of what's happened here in terms of what I've lost, and then I have a new appreciation for it. But there's a fair amount of resentment that I have to make this adaptation. And in a lot of cases, people don't have to. They can stay in suspended animation, if you will. And this sense of acceptance can be resisted. They can just keep everything the same, acting as if nothing has really changed. And that's part of this environment that we're talking about and looking at with this stage 3. What is needed in this task, this is not stage 3 task, is that I have to find a way, and this is part of working through this, all right? Because, again, our tendency is to take tasks and think of them along a timeline. But I have to cycle through these and have to think through these, and ultimately I have to redefine what the loss actually means for me, and slowly begin to construct a meaning around the loss. What does it mean to me in terms of re-engaging in relationships? A lot of times when we're in intimate relationships, our world tends to shrink. It shrinks down to the person that we're focused on. The other people in our lives, while important, often blur out to the edges. And so now that person is now gone, and I have to sharpen my focus in terms of my other relationships, spending more time with them than maybe I would have before. And so I have to redefine what it means to me and what it is meant about me, which is another part of this task, because I may need some time to talk with other people that are going through this process so that I can make sure I don't get trapped in shame messages. that I've lost this person because I'm a bad person and I can't do relationships good, or there's something fatally wrong with me and that's why this thing has happened. And this is all part of the work that has to be done around task 3, is redefining the loss is a big portion of it. Some other things that come up in this is the internal adjustments. So that was the external. The internal adjustments is in terms of self-definition. Ultimately, when we're in relationship with people, they are part of our definition of who we are. Now, that's not being enmeshed or codependent or anything like that. But in a lot of cases, men and women, not just women, we define ourselves in terms of the relationship. Now, women tend to be more calibrated. We talked a little bit about this with gender and grief, but are a little bit more calibrated to defining their worth and value by the nature of the value of the relationship they're in. They feel bad when the relationship is not so good, and they feel good when it's close and intimate. So the loss of a significant other oftentimes feels like the loss of myself and who I am and where I fit in the world, and going back into it. The other part of it is the self-esteem piece, is that when we're in a significant relationship with other people, or even focused on a future that gets taken away, then I suddenly lose my sense of self and all that I've invested in this future that I've been constructing, that I matter, that I'm moving toward this thing, and now it's not there anymore, and I'm not real sure who I am. The third thing, of course, is that losing some sense of control over the world. We get reminded again and again what we don't have control over. We don't take very kindly to it. And it has a direct impact on what we call self-efficacy. In other words, my ability to impact the world and act in instrumental ways. So these internal adjustments are things that we have to contend with and make some adjustments too. The last one is the spiritual adjustments, and that means reconstructing a world of meaning that has been challenged by this loss. We have to talk about what's actually happened. This goes back to what we were talking about, or what you heard Rebecca Payton talking about it. Because she said, once my sister died, I could not stop talking about it. Well, this is the event story. And that's what Rebecca Payton was actually talking about, is that we need to tell our stories of loss, to incorporate them into who I am in the world and how that works, how I work within the world, or how I'm seen within the world. It also includes not only the event story, but what led up to it, the backstory. And a lot of times after a relationship is stopped or broken or whatever, we end up sometimes getting a clearer view of what was actually going on in the relationship that led up to that. And we need to process this with somebody who values this idea of processing, and not everybody does. So I'd take you back to a lot of the things we talked about with safe people. We have to discern and understand who the people in our lives are that value this idea of processing. And they're not quick to tell us what to think and how to think. They are quick to accept us where we are and how we feel. And that's a very big part of that. So when we lose relationships and we lose things in our lives, it challenges a lot of our life values and beliefs, even about God. And that's okay. It's going to be shaken. And so being less concerned about it being shaken and more concerned about moving into it and wrestling with the questions it may raise for us. Because that's what this is doing. This whole thing with coronavirus and everybody being sent home and having to work from home and everything else, I'm contained in this little room of 10 by 10 called my office at home. Sometimes I sit outside of myself and watch myself, and I look like a neurotic animal in the zoo pacing back and forth because of just not being able to get out. And the lectures that I do with you guys, I'm up front, I'm moving around, I'm pointing to things, I'm thinking of other things, I'm watching your faces, I'm getting the input back from you all, and I'm adjusting even as I'm going around that. But I don't have that now. Now that doesn't mean that I'm less significant or that my value about trying to communicate to you through this means is as effectively as possible as I can still holds true. It hasn't shaken my beliefs about that stuff, but how do I go about doing that? And is it good enough? And here we go. All right, here we go with the whole idea of good enough, and wherever that starts showing up, then shame is not too far away, and I need to keep my radar well tuned for it. Because if I can't contribute like I've always contributed before, then what does that mean about my worth and who I am? And that's part of these spiritual adjustments that we're talking about here. So task 3 continues in these 3 basic assumptions that are challenged. The world is a benevolent place. Generally, we cut deals with God and say, if I, then you. And so if I am obedient and I do my quiet times and I am a good Christian or whatever that means, then the world will work. It will work and I will experience blessings and things will go great. Well, a virus like this doesn't really give a rat's patoot about that. And the world doesn't make sense. We've had this conversation here in my home about this. I have people that are saying, I just don't understand. I don't understand what is out there. What's in the future? What are we going to face? What other decisions are we going to have to make? And so the world makes sense. Generally, we assume that it does. And then when it doesn't, we think that God is to blame oftentimes. So we've got that assumption. And then finally, that I'm worthy. I'm worthy of being in people's lives and being heard and being valued and things like that. Those are embedded in us. Those are implicit. And we don't really see them until they get challenged by the kind of environments and things that we're talking about here. So task 3, another thing to keep in mind is something that is oftentimes referred to as complicated spiritual grief, and it's all directed at God in terms of our resentment and doubt. When we spent time talking about the mile markers and the anger turned outward, oftentimes we point our anger at God. If he was really a good God, he wouldn't let things like this happen, kind of thing, and that comes up. I mean, we're walking into, this is Holy Week, we're moving into Easter, and the purest definition of the God we have is what we celebrate on Easter. But that doesn't take into account the broken world we live in, or the broken bodies that we live in, where viruses can invade and take over. So we're going to have these things and these doubts toward God. A lot of times you will hear plenty of people be very dissatisfied with the kind of support that they get. There are expectations that they have of the church and the church people, Christians, about how they are supposed to be supported. And this is why I spend as much time as I do talking about this, about our relationships. Because if I'm going to walk with people, I need to find a way to walk with them, not for them, and allow them to set the pace, not me. And so inevitably, the grief will impact our spiritual beliefs, our understanding of who God is, sometimes for the better, sometimes not. And it's ultimately, as I have down here, it's not how to find an answer, but how to live without one. Now that may seem terribly dissatisfying, but I would point you to either I get an answer, so I have an explanation, I can avoid and allowing it to happen again, and then everything will be fine, or I move deeper into this mystery called trusting God's heart for me. And I don't always get an answer because of that, but I do have a connection in the relationship I have, and the trust that is part of that is in this task 3. And this is one of those places where the spiritual adjustments that people have to make, we oftentimes minimize because it's not hitting our radar. We understand the internal, those things I can kind of wrap my head around. External, without a shadow of doubt, I can certainly understand that. But the spiritual is getting into people's hearts. It's getting into my own heart. And trying to do that, and kind of like Job's friends before they open their mouths, is sitting Shiva with somebody, allowing them to tell their story. Here comes the stuff from Rebecca Payton. Here comes the stuff that I just talked about, the event story and the story that led up to it, and all the things that go into that is very much a part of living life without always having an answer. And what do I have left? And that's exactly the spiritual crisis that sometimes people are left with. So, where we go to and how we go about sabotaging this is just failing to adapt, is shutting down, asking other people to do the work for us, not developing the skills that we have, withdrawing from the world, doing all of those things that are very much a way to sabotage this thing that is referred to as task 3. And that's a key part of this that we have to take time to look at and do. Each one of these tasks, all right, can be sabotaged. Each one of them can be. And that really is an important point to keep in mind, is that they take that amount of that they all can be sabotaged. I can find all sorts of ways to not get this job done, if you will, the work that is to be done in this task 3. And that's inevitable when we're talking about tasks, not time. And that's the key, okay, is tasks, not time. There's work to be done. Everybody has a little bit different work to be done around it. And it's going to be different for everybody. And that's the annoying, aggravating part of grief, is that everybody comes at it, everybody experiences it a little bit differently than other people do, which means ultimately that my challenge is to understand the other person enough to know how they will do it, not how I think they should do it. And that's a big part of walking with people through it. We get to task 4, and task 4 is withdrawing the emotional energy from the broken relationship or the future that isn't going to occur or any of that, and beginning to reinvest it in other things that might lead to another path. I can tell you, not from a relational point of view, but the future that I had set in my mind when I entered my undergrad was not the future that I walked out of school with. And I would say I went through a grief experience, a crisis, because I was so mad that it seemed like I wasn't able to accomplish what I had set out to do. And I felt like a failure. I felt like I couldn't do anything right. All of those things came up until I began to get to this point where I withdrew my emotional investment in that one path and began to explore other paths. That would be a path thing in terms of life and future and other things like that. That's not even related to a relationship. I had other relationships going on around that. So the idea of continuing bonds is to find a way to remember what has been lost in the midst of embarking on something new, on the rest of one's journey through life. And that's where the challenge is, and that's why I included this quote, because it is really very important. A mourner never altogether forgets the dead person the future that was lost, the lost relationship I'm substituting, who was so highly valued in life and never totally withdraws his investment in that representation. See, we tend to keep a space in us for the things that we have lost. You might want to call it, a room in our hearts that we have, that we walk through and remember the things that have been lost. We can never purge those who have been close to us from our own history, except by psychic acts that are really ultimately damaging to our identity. Why? Because the things that have been lost are as important in the construction and the development of our identity as the things that we gain. We've talked about this, is that we live in a world of contrast. Joy doesn't have much under meaning to us if I haven't experienced sorrow. And good and bad and happy and sad and all of these things. So we seem to be bent on removing all of the things that actually add depth to who we are by trying to remove all of the things that have contributed to the sadness in our lives. Now, I know that sounds kind of crazy, because the upshot of it isn't that I'm trying to find something to always be sad about. But it has more to do with this idea of acceptance. Am I willing to move in to that for a time, not forever, but for a time, to allow an opportunity for my heart to reconstruct, to reweave the story, to have that story be part of our lives. See, each of us will have this with this quarantining and lockdown and everything else, is that at some point in our future, we will have a story to tell, just like your great-grandparents did around the Depression. And a lot of people are making parallels to the Great Depression for what we're going through right now. It changes all of life. It changes how we see ourselves and our relationships. It impacts everything about our culture and how we relate relationally even, or how we greet each other, or how much space do we leave between all of these things. And that's part of the story, but we have to take the time to reweave the story or repaint the story with these things that are very much a part of it. So task 4 is another great quote. A survivor's readiness to enter a new relationship depends on not giving up the dead spouse, but on finding a suitable place for the spouse in the psychological life of the person who's lost that. A place that is important, but it leaves room for others. And see, that's, again, like I've been talking about, our willingness to enter into a new future with a different trajectory and all the different things that go with it. The process of grieving is creating space in our hearts to allow the lost part to still be there, but increase the space for other new experiences to be a part of it. So as it says here, finding an appropriate place for the lost item, person, situation, future in our emotional lives, a place that will enable us to go on living. And that's a part of this backdrop that is set with these tasks that we're talking about. So like any task, it's task, not time. So with any task, there is work to be done. And what I'm describing for you is kind of the landscape of each of the things. So I turn my attention to this time of it's time to reinvest in a new future, a new relationship, whatever that might be, and the time that it takes for me to do that and move into that. But it doesn't mean I have to reject or deny what's happened. I have to leave it in its place in this room in my heart that has the things that have been lost, that are part of my history, part of my identity. I quite honestly couldn't be teaching this class, and I would not say that this is this is why, but I could not be teaching this class if I haven't taken the time to sit in that room thinking about and processing the loss of my dad and the impact that it's had. It set the stage for the next losses I had for my mom, my adoptive mom, or my mother-in-law, which I mentioned at the beginning of this class. See, those things impact who I am. My willingness to live with the uncertainty of an answer that there isn't one, a question that there's no answer for. And a willingness to be open that if further experiences come along, they will actually help me have a bigger and broader understanding of what that answer might actually be. So the fourth task, and we've been talking about this as we've gone along, is the fourth task is hindered. Each one of these tasks can be sabotaged. And the fourth task is sabotage when one holds on to the past attachment in a way that precludes from forming any new ones. So in other words, the person goes into the room, pulls the door shut, locks it from all of life, and they stay there. And I have mentioned to you before that my mom would probably fit into that category. The closet that she kept all of my dad's things in, she might as well have locked herself in, because it interfered with her ability to form new relationships, including with me, and that was really part of the landscape. So this has taken me a lot longer than I expected in terms of getting through all of Worden's tasks and so forth. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide this up, and then we'll take another lecture time to look at Kubler-Ross and unpacking all of her stuff, and then adding in another lecture of the final model, which is mine, so that I can take some time to unpack each one of these. I don't want to rush through them because it's important. These models are not gospel truth. There are things about them that no doubt will resonate with you, that make sense to you. And in a lot of cases, a model is useful because it guides our decisions in terms of our relationships, in terms of processing our own losses and experiences like that. So in light of that, let me show you just the first slide, and then I'll pick it up the next time with this. But this is a schematic, if you will, of Kubler-Ross's model. I will unpack this further in the next lecture. This is one kind of schematic, like I said, that you probably haven't seen before. And this is closer to her understanding, or how she described grieving and grief and grieving. Is that we start at normal functioning, and then there are loops, and these loops are where some of the things that we're accustomed to from her model, we've heard a lot about: the shock and denial, the anger, the depression, the dialogue and bargaining, etc. So I want to unpack each one of those next time, and we will take the time to do that so that we don't short shrift it. It's an important model. It's the big, it's the 800-pound gorilla, if you will, that has been kind of dominating the landscape for a long time. I want to be sure to give it the time that it's due. And so I'm going to end here, and I'll close this one down. I'll have a new lecture for you next time to look at Kubler-Ross's stages, and that what that also means is that when we get to watching Tuesdays with Maury, you can watch it on one day where a lecture normally would be, and do it all the way through. I had originally planned our schedule to be watching it on two separate class days, so we can collapse it since we've got time now, given the circumstances we're in. I will stream it right out of Blackboard, just like I did with Shadowland. So be patient. I'll get it up and ready to roll for the week after next, and that will be our Tuesday activity for class. And then what's left after that will be because we'll have Kubler-Ross's stages next week. The week after that will be Tuesdays with Maury. The week after that will be my model. And then the last week is going to be specific types of grief. What I want to do on that last week is do a live Zoom call for everybody in the class, if we can manage it. That sounds like a steep steep effort to do, but I would like to do that, at least to be able to have an opportunity to interact with you all one last time as a class. I'm going to have 40 some faces on my computer, which would be worth doing a screenshot of, but that would be fine. I would like to make some final last connection. The other thing I'll remind you of is the lecture Q&A voice thread that I've put up. I will carry it over to this week and the week after. So if there's something I've said and it's not clear, or you want more information or clarification, please put your question up there, because then when I respond to it, then everybody else can hear what it's all about. So it's been good spending the evening with you. Yeah, I'm doing it in the evening. And I hope your continued involvement in groups goes well for each of you to be able to have a place to process, as we've been talking about with Worden's model. So blessings to all. I hope you have a good evening.